Have you ever been in a relationship where you felt like you were walking on eggshells, never knowing what might set off the person who claimed to love you? Maybe you're from a small town where everyone knows everyone's business. Or perhaps you're in a big city where it's easy to disappear into the crowd. Wherever you are, I want you to imagine what it feels like when the mask finally slips, and you realize the person sitting across from you isn't who you thought they were at all. Sophia Chin had been telling herself for months that Derek was just stressed. Work was demanding. His father was pushing him to take over more of the family construction business, and she understood that pressure could make people snappier than usual. At 24, she'd been in enough relationships to know that nobody was perfect, and Derek had so many good qualities. He was ambitious, successful, and when he smiled at her like she was the most important person in his world, she could almost forget about the other times. Almost. The restaurant he'd chosen for their dinner was the kind of place that required reservations weeks in advance. All white linens and crystal glasses that probably cost more than Sophia made in a week working at the Meridian Art Gallery. She'd worn her nicest dress, a simple black number that she'd bought on sale but still made her feel elegant, and had spent an hour perfecting her makeup. Derek liked when she made an effort, and tonight felt important somehow, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. He'd been quiet during the drive, his jaw tight as he navigated the downtown traffic, and Sophia had learned not to fill those silences with chatter. Derek needed space to decompress, he'd told her once, and she'd nodded like it made perfect sense. Now, sitting across from him in the elegant restaurant, she watched him scan the wine list with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life. "I was thinking we could take that weekend trip to Napa you mentioned," Sophia said carefully, testing the waters. "My gallery is doing well this month, and I could probably get Friday off." Derek's pale blue eyes flicked up from the menu, and something cold settled in Sophia's stomach at his expression. "We've talked about this, Sophia. I don't have time for vacation planning right now. The Morrison project is behind schedule, and my father is breathing down my neck about the quarterly numbers." She nodded quickly, familiar with the drill. "Of course, I just thought maybe when things settled down." "When things settled down," Derek repeated, his voice carrying that edge she'd been hearing more often lately. "Things don't settle down in my world, Sophia. There's always another project, another deadline, another crisis. That's what it means to be responsible for something bigger than yourself." The waiter approached their table, a young man with nervous energy who seemed to sense the tension radiating from their corner booth. Derek ordered for both of them without asking what Sophia wanted, something he'd started doing more frequently over the past few months. She told herself it was thoughtful, that he was taking care of her, but the lamb he'd ordered was something she didn't particularly enjoy, and he knew that. Sophia found herself studying Derek's profile as he spoke to the waiter about wine pairings. When had his attention to detail started feeling less like care and more like control? When had his strong opinions begun to crowd out her own preferences entirely? She could remember, early in their relationship, how impressed she'd been by his confidence, the way he could walk into any room and command attention. Now, 8 months later, she was beginning to understand that confidence and dominance weren't always the same thing. The restaurant was crowded, filled with the kind of people who wore their wealth casually, and Sophia felt out of place in a way that had nothing to do with her dress or makeup. It was something deeper, a growing sense that she was performing a role she'd never auditioned for, playing a version of herself that Derek had carefully constructed. At a table across the dining room, a man sat alone, and despite herself, Sophia found her attention drifting in his direction. He was probably in his early 30s, with dark hair and olive skin, wearing a suit that was clearly expensive but worn with the kind of ease that suggested money was never a concern. There was something about the way he carried himself, even sitting down, that spoke of authority and power, but unlike Derek's aggressive confidence, this man's presence felt controlled, dangerous in a way that was both frightening and oddly compelling. Their eyes met briefly across the restaurant, and Sophia felt a jolt of electricity that caught her completely off guard. The stranger's dark gaze was intense, assessing, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through her carefully constructed composure to the fear and confusion underneath. She looked away quickly, heat rising in her cheeks, but she could still feel his attention like a physical weight. Derek was talking about the Morrison project again, his voice gaining volume as he described his frustrations with the subcontractors and his father's unrealistic expectations. Sophia tried to focus on his words, but her attention kept fragmenting. The way his fingers gripped his wine glass, white-knuckled with tension. The sharp angle of his jaw when he was angry. The way he spoke about other people like they were obstacles to be overcome rather than human beings deserving of basic respect. When did you become so selfish, Sophia? The words cut through her scattered thoughts like a blade, and she realized Derek had been talking directly to her, asking her something she'd completely missed while lost in her own head. I'm sorry, what did you say? Derek's expression shifted, the practiced charm he wore in public slipping just enough to reveal the cold anger underneath. I said, when did you become so selfish? I'm trying to explain why this weekend won't work for the trip you keep pushing, and you're sitting there staring off into space like what I'm saying doesn't matter to you. Sophia's mouth went dry. I wasn't staring off into space, Derek. I was listening. You were talking about the project timeline. Don't lie to me, Sophia. I saw you looking around the room, checking out other men like I'm not even here. Do you think I'm stupid? The accusation hit her like a physical blow, and Sophia felt the familiar panic rising in her chest. This was how these conversations always went, how Derek could twist reality until she questioned her own perceptions. She hadn't been checking out other men. She'd been lost in thought, trying to process the growing unease that had been building for weeks. But Derek's version of events was always so confident, so detailed, that she found herself wondering if maybe she had been doing what he accused her of without realizing it. That's not what I was doing, she said quietly, aware that other diners might be listening. I was just thinking about work, about the exhibition we're planning for next month. Derek leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if he'd shouted. You're embarrassing me, Sophia. I bring you to a nice place. I'm trying to have a conversation about my life, my problems, and you're acting like a child who can't pay attention for 5 minutes. She could feel tears threatening, that familiar burn behind her eyes that always seemed to surface during these confrontations. The worst part was that Derek wasn't entirely wrong. She had been distracted. She had been looking around the room. She had let her mind wander while he was talking. But somehow, his reaction felt so disproportionate to her offense that she couldn't reconcile the two. I'm sorry, she whispered, hating herself for the automatic apology that rose to her lips. You're right. I should have been paying better attention. Derek sat back, satisfied with her capitulation, but Sophia could see that his anger wasn't entirely appeased. There was still something cold and calculating in his expression, something that suggested this conversation wasn't over, that her punishment would be extracted later, in private, where there would be no witnesses to hear whatever he decided she deserved. You're done when we get home, Derek said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a promise and a threat. We're going to have a serious conversation about respect and priorities, Sophia. I think you've forgotten who's been taking care of you, who's been patient with your little art gallery hobby while you figure out what you actually want to do with your life. The words hung in the air between them, and Sophia felt something cold and final settle in her chest. This wasn't about her being distracted at dinner. This wasn't about work stress or family pressure or any of the other explanations she'd been making for Derek's behavior over the past few months. This was about control, about power, about making sure she understood exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of his priorities. She glanced around the restaurant desperately, suddenly needing to ground herself in something real and immediate. The elegant dining room that had felt so sophisticated when they'd arrived now felt like a stage set, a beautiful facade, hiding something rotten underneath. Her gaze swept past the other diners, past the attentive waitstaff, and landed again on the dark-haired stranger who'd caught her attention earlier. He was no longer looking at his phone or his meal. He was looking directly at their table, and his expression had shifted from casual interest to something much more focused and dangerous. Sophia had the strangest feeling that he'd been listening, that somehow he'd heard Derek's quiet threat and understood its implications in a way that maybe even she was only beginning to comprehend. The stranger's dark eyes met hers again, and this time she didn't look away. There was something in his gaze that felt like recognition, like he understood exactly what kind of conversation was happening at their table and exactly how it was likely to end. For just a moment, Sophia felt less alone, less trapped, less like she was drowning in a situation she couldn't control or escape. Then Derek's hand closed over hers on the table, his grip just slightly too tight, and she was pulled back into the reality of her situation. Whatever was happening across the restaurant, whatever she thought she'd seen in a stranger's eyes, it couldn't change the fact that she was here, now, with Derek, and that in a few hours she would have to go home with him and face whatever consequences he decided she deserved for her imagined transgressions. The stranger was standing now, moving with the kind of fluid grace that suggested both confidence and barely contained power. Sophia watched from the corner of her eye as he approached their table, her heart beginning to race for reasons she couldn't entirely identify. Derek, still holding her hand in his possessive grip, hadn't noticed the approaching figure. Too focused on the quiet litany of her failures, he was reciting like a prayer he'd memorized. "Excuse me," the stranger said, his voice carrying just enough authority to cut through Derek's monologue without seeming rude or aggressive. "I believe we have a mutual business associate. Vincent Morrison from Morrison Construction?" Derek's grip on Sophia's hand tightened reflexively as he looked up at the stranger, his expression shifting from irritation at the interruption to something that might have been recognition, though Sophia couldn't imagine how Derek would know someone like this. The man standing beside their table radiated a kind of controlled power that Derek, for all his bluster and aggression, had never possessed. Where Derek commanded through force and intimidation, this stranger seemed to hold authority as naturally as breathing. "Vincent Morrison," Derek repeated, his voice carefully neutral in a way that immediately put Sophia on alert. She knew that tone, the one Derek used when he was trying to figure out how much trouble he might be in. "Yes, we're working on a project together. You know Vince." The stranger smiled, and Sophia felt her pulse quicken at the transformation it brought to his features. When he'd been watching their table from across the room, his expression had been hard, almost predatory. Now, with that smile, he looked younger, more approachable, though something dangerous still lurked beneath the surface charm. "Dante Romano," he said, extending his hand to Derek with the kind of easy confidence that suggested he was accustomed to people knowing his name. "Vince and I have done business together for years. Construction can be such a challenging industry, especially when you're trying to balance family expectations with professional growth." Sophia watched Derek's face carefully as he shook Dante's offered hand, noting the way her boyfriend's shoulders tensed slightly at the mention of family expectations. How had this stranger known about Derek's complicated relationship with his father? Had Derek mentioned it to Vincent Morrison, or was Dante Romano the kind of man who made it his business to know things about people? "Derek Hartwell," her boyfriend replied, his voice still carrying that careful neutrality. "I don't think Vince has mentioned you." Dante's smile widened slightly, though it didn't quite reach his dark eyes. "Oh, Vince and I prefer to keep our business arrangements discreet. You understand how it is in our line of work. Sometimes the most important partnerships are the ones that don't make it into the official paperwork." There was something in the way Dante spoke that made Sophia think he wasn't talking about construction at all, though she couldn't begin to guess what kind of business he might actually be involved in. What she did know was that Derek was nervous in a way she'd never seen before, his usual aggressive confidence replaced by the careful politeness of someone who wasn't sure exactly where he stood. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," Dante continued, his gaze flicking briefly to Sophia before returning to Derek. "I couldn't help but notice you from across the room, and I thought I should introduce myself. Vince speaks very highly of your work on the Morrison project. He says you're exactly the kind of detail-oriented professional he needs for his more challenging developments." Derek preened slightly at the praise, his grip on Sophia's hand loosening as his ego responded to the flattery. She took advantage of his distraction to study Dante more carefully, noting the way his expensive suit fit perfectly across broad shoulders, the subtle gold watch at his wrist, the way he held himself with the kind of easy authority that came from never having to prove his power to anyone. "Thank you," Derek said, his chest puffing out slightly. "The Morrison project has been demanding, but I pride myself on delivering results regardless of the obstacles. My father always taught me that excellence requires sacrifice, both from yourself and from the people in your life." At these words, Dante's attention shifted fully to Sophia for the first time since approaching their table, and she felt the impact of his focused gaze like a physical force. His dark eyes seemed to take in everything about her at once, From the careful way she held herself to the faint redness around her wrist where Derek's grip had been too tight, to the way she'd been sitting in absolute silence while the men spoke around her as if she weren't there. Sacrifice, Dante repeated thoughtfully, his voice carrying just enough emphasis on the word to make Derek shift uncomfortably. That's an interesting philosophy. Though I've always believed that true strength comes from protecting the people you care about, not from demanding sacrifices from them. The comment hung in the air between them, and Sophia felt her breath catch as she realized Dante was challenging Derek, subtly but unmistakably calling out the very behavior she'd been trying to rationalize for months. Derek's jaw tightened, his politician's smile becoming strained around the edges. Of course protection is important, Derek said carefully. But sometimes people need guidance to understand what's truly in their best interests. Not everyone has the experience or perspective to make good decisions on their own. Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implicit insult, at the way Derek spoke about her, as if she were a child incapable of managing her own life. She'd been making her own decisions just fine before she met Derek, supporting herself through college, building her career at the gallery, maintaining her own apartment and relationships. When had she allowed herself to become someone who needed constant guidance and correction? Dante seemed to read her thoughts in her expression, his dark eyes softening with what might have been understanding or sympathy. I find that people generally know what they need, he said quietly, his gaze holding hers. Sometimes they just need someone to create the space for them to act on that knowledge. Derek was beginning to look genuinely unsettled now, his free hand fidgeting with his wine glass as he tried to decode the subtext of the conversation. Sophia could see him struggling to determine whether Dante was criticizing him directly or merely offering a different perspective on leadership and relationships. Well, Derek said finally, his voice carrying a forced lightness that didn't quite mask his irritation. I appreciate your insights, Mr. Romano, but I think Sophia and I should probably get back to our dinner. We have some important things to discuss tonight. The reminder of what awaited her when they got home sent a chill through Sophia's entire body. She glanced toward the restaurant's restroom, suddenly desperate for a few minutes away from the table, away from Derek's possessive grip and the increasingly tense conversation between the two men. Actually, she said quietly, surprised by her own boldness in speaking up, I think I need to excuse myself for a moment. Derek's grip on her hand tightened again, his smile becoming sharp around the edges. Can't it wait, sweetheart? We're in the middle of a conversation. The casual endearment, spoken with just enough edge to remind her of her place, made something inside Sophia's chest twist with anger and humiliation. She was 24 years old, a college graduate with her own career and her own bank account, and she was sitting in a restaurant asking permission to use the restroom like a child at a family dinner. Dante stepped back slightly from the table, creating a clear path toward the back of the restaurant. Please don't let me interrupt your evening any longer, he said to Derek, though his eyes remained fixed on Sophia. It was a pleasure meeting you both. I hope the rest of your evening goes exactly as it should. There was something in the way he emphasized those last words that made Sophia think he was speaking directly to her, offering some kind of encouragement or permission that she wasn't entirely sure how to interpret. She stood carefully, extracting her hand from Derek's grip with more determination than she'd shown in months. Excuse me, she murmured, and walked toward the restrooms without waiting for Derek's permission. The ladies' room was elegant and empty, all marble surfaces and soft lighting that should have been calming, but somehow only served to highlight the shakiness in Sophia's hands as she gripped the edge of the vanity. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, taking in her pale complexion and the way her lipstick had worn off from nervously biting her lower lip throughout dinner. What was she doing? What was she thinking, walking away from the table when Derek was already angry with her, when she knew that every act of defiance would be catalogued and used against her later? And what was she supposed to make of Dante Romano and his carefully chosen words, his obvious wealth and power, his apparent interest in her situation? The door opened behind her, and Sophia's heart jumped as she prepared to face Derek's anger at her extended absence. Instead, she saw Dante's reflection in the mirror, and her pulse quickened for entirely different reasons. This is the women's restroom, she said quietly, though she made no move toward the door. Yes, it is, Dante replied, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. I wanted to speak with you privately for a moment, away from your boyfriend's attention. Sophia turned to face him, acutely aware of how small the space felt with his presence filling it. He was taller than she'd realized, probably 6 foot tall, and up close she could see the way his dark suit was tailored to emphasize the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his build. There was something about him that suggested violence, but not the kind of crude aggression Derek favored. This was something more refined, more controlled, infinitely more dangerous. I don't think this is appropriate, she said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew she didn't mean them. Nothing about her situation was appropriate anymore. Sophia, Dante said, and the sound of her name in his voice made something inside her chest flutter traitorously. That man you're with, he's going to hurt you. If not tonight, then soon. You know this, don't you? The direct statement hit her like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the truth she'd been avoiding for weeks. Derek had never actually hit her, had never done anything she could point to as obviously abusive, but his threats were becoming more specific, his anger more volatile, his control over her daily life more complete. I don't know what you mean, she lied, hating herself for the automatic denial even as the words left her mouth. Dante stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her think of leather and smoke. He's already hurting you, he said quietly. I can see it in the way you hold yourself, the way you apologize for things that aren't your fault, the way you ask for permission to exist in your own life. Tears burned behind Sophia's eyes as his words stripped away all her careful rationalizations and self-deceptions. He was right, of course. Derek was hurting her, had been hurting her for months in ways that left no visible marks, but somehow felt more damaging than physical violence might have been. Why do you care? She whispered. You don't even know me. Dante's hand came up slowly, telegraphing his intention, and gently cupped her cheek. His skin was warm, his touch surprisingly gentle for someone who radiated such controlled danger. I know enough, he said softly. I know you deserve better than what you're accepting. I know you're stronger than you think you are. And I know that if you go home with him tonight, things are going to escalate beyond what you're prepared to handle. Sophia closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite every rational thought telling her this was insane. She was standing in a restaurant bathroom with a complete stranger, a man who was obviously involved in something illegal or dangerous, letting him touch her face while her boyfriend waited at their table, probably planning her punishment for this exact kind of behavior. What are you suggesting? She asked, opening her eyes to meet his intense dark gaze. Come with me, Dante said simply. Let me take you somewhere safe while we figure out a more permanent solution to your situation. The offer hung between them, impossible and tempting and terrifying all at once. Sophia knew nothing about this man except that he was wealthy, powerful, and apparently concerned enough about her welfare to risk confronting Derek in a public restaurant. For all she knew, Dante Romano could be even more dangerous than the boyfriend she was trying to escape. But as she stood there in the elegant restroom, feeling the warmth of his hand against her cheek and seeing something like genuine care in his dark eyes, Sophia realized that she trusted this stranger more than she trusted the man she'd been dating for 8 months. At least Dante's danger was honest, undisguised, offered with full knowledge of what he was. Derek's cruelty had been wrapped in declarations of love and concern, making her question her own perceptions and judgment until she no longer knew what was real. I can't just leave with you, she said finally. I don't know anything about you. Dante's smile was sad and understanding. You're right to be cautious. But think about what you do know about him, and ask yourself if staying is really the safer choice. Before Sophia could respond, the bathroom door opened and Derek stepped inside, his face twisted with anger and something that might have been panic. His gaze moved between Sophia and Dante, taking in their proximity, the way Dante's hand still rested against her cheek, the obvious intimacy of their conversation. What the hell is going on here? Derek demanded, his voice rising dangerously. Dante stepped back from Sophia smoothly, his movement casual and unthreatening, though something in his posture suggested he was ready for violence if Derek chose to escalate the situation. Your girlfriend seemed distressed, Dante said calmly. I was offering assistance. Derek's laugh was harsh and ugly. Assistance? Right. Is that what we're calling it now? Sophia, get away from him. We're leaving. Now. The command in Derek's voice triggered every submissive response Derek had been conditioning in her for months. But somehow, with Dante's calm presence beside her, Sophia found the strength to resist. "I'm not ready to leave yet," she said quietly, surprised by her own boldness. Derek's face went white with rage. "Excuse me?" "You heard her," Dante said, his voice still calm, but carrying an undertone that made Derek take an involuntary step backward. "The lady isn't ready to leave." The tension in the small space was explosive, and Sophia realized that Derek was calculating whether he could take Dante in a fight, weighing his anger against his sense of self-preservation. She could see the moment he decided discretion was the better part of valor, though the look he gave her promised retribution later. "Fine," Derek said tightly. "Sophia, you have 5 minutes to come to your senses. I'll be waiting at the table, and then we're going home to have that conversation we discussed." He left without another word, and Sophia sagged against the vanity as the adrenaline of the confrontation left her system. "You can't go with him," Dante said quietly. "Not tonight. Not after this." Sophia looked at him. This dangerous stranger who was offering her an escape she wasn't sure she deserved or could trust. "If I go with you," she whispered, "what happens next?" Dante's smile was gentle and sad and full of promise. "Next, we make sure you're safe. Everything else, we'll figure out together." The elevator climbed 47 floors in silence, so smooth Sophia barely felt the movement, her stomach still churning from the decision she'd made in the restaurant bathroom 20 minutes earlier. She'd walked out with Dante Romano, leaving Derek at their table with nothing but a brief explanation that she needed time to think. The look of pure rage on Derek's face as she'd gathered her purse would haunt her, she was certain, but not as much as the thought of going home with him and facing whatever punishment he'd devised for her defiance. Now, standing beside this dark stranger in an elevator that probably cost more than her entire yearly salary, Sophia was beginning to question the wisdom of her choice. What did she really know about Dante Romano except that he was wealthy, dangerous, and apparently opposed to men who threatened women? For all she knew, she'd traded one form of captivity for another, one that might be more comfortable but potentially far more dangerous. The elevator opened directly into Dante's penthouse, and Sophia's breath caught as she stepped into a space that belonged in an architectural magazine rather than real life. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, the lights below twinkling like scattered diamonds against black velvet. The furniture was modern and elegant, all clean lines and neutral colors that probably cost more than most people's cars. Everything spoke of wealth so casual and complete that it had moved beyond display in a simple fact. Her own studio apartment, with its second-hand furniture and bathroom she shared with the neighbor down the hall, felt like a different universe compared to this. The contrast made her acutely aware of how far she was from her normal world, how little she belonged in Dante's sphere of wealth and power and casual luxury. "Welcome to my home," Dante said, his voice carrying none of the tension that had marked their interactions in the restaurant. Here, in his own space, he seemed more relaxed, though she could still sense the controlled danger that seemed to be as much a part of him as breathing. "It's beautiful," Sophia said honestly, though beautiful felt inadequate to describe the sophisticated elegance surrounding her. "It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She considered the question, trying to articulate her assumptions about how someone like Dante would live. "Something more obvious, I think. More stereotypically intimidating. This looks like it belongs to a successful businessman, not a what?" Dante prompted when she trailed off. "Not a criminal," Sophia finished quietly, the word hanging in the air between them like an admission of guilt. Dante moved to the kitchen, which flowed seamlessly from the living area, all granite countertops and professional-grade appliances. "I am a successful businessman," he said, pulling out ingredients from the refrigerator with practiced ease. "I also happen to be involved in activities that fall outside conventional legal boundaries." The two aren't mutually exclusive. His matter-of-fact tone about his criminal activities should have terrified her, should have sent her running for the door. Instead, Sophia found herself oddly grateful for his honesty. Derek had spent months lying to her about small things, manipulating reality to serve his purposes, making her question her own perceptions. Dante's straightforward admission of his illegal activities felt refreshingly honest by comparison. What kind of activities? She asked, settling onto one of the bar stools that lined the kitchen island. Dante began chopping vegetables with the kind of precision that suggested he was comfortable with knives in more than just a culinary context. My family has been involved in various business ventures in this city for 3 generations. Some of those ventures operate in legal gray areas. Others are more definitively outside the law. The euphemistic language didn't hide the reality of what he was telling her. Sophia had grown up in this city. She'd watched enough movies and read enough newspapers to understand what 3 generations of family business ventures usually meant. Dante Romano was Mafia, probably high-ranking given the obvious wealth and power he wielded so casually. "Does that frighten you?" he asked, glancing up from his chopping to study her reaction. "Yes," Sophia said honestly, "but not as much as going home with Derek tonight would have." Dante's hands stilled on the knife, his dark eyes searching her face. "Tell me about Derek. How long has this been going on?" The question opened a floodgate Sophia hadn't realized she'd been holding back. 8 months, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We met at a gallery opening. He was charming, successful, confident. Everything seemed perfect at first. But things changed. Gradually. So gradually, I didn't notice it happening. He started making suggestions about my clothes, my friends, my work schedule. When I disagreed with him, he'd get this hurt expression and tell me he was only trying to help, that he cared about me and wanted what was best for me." Dante resumed his cooking, but she could feel his attention focused entirely on her words. "Classic manipulation," he said quietly, "making you question your own judgment while positioning himself as the only person who truly understood what you needed." "Exactly," Sophia said, relief flooding through her at his understanding. "It sounds so obvious when you say it like that. But when you're living through it, when someone you care about is telling you that your instincts are wrong, that your friends don't really care about you, that your job isn't important enough to prioritize over the relationship, it becomes easier to just go along with what he wants than to fight about everything. And tonight he told me I was done when we got home, that we were going to have a serious conversation about respect and priorities. The way he said it, the look in his eyes, I knew something had shifted. That whatever was going to happen when we got back to his place was going to be worse than anything he'd done before." Dante's jaw tightened as he listened, his movements becoming more precise and controlled. "Have you told anyone else about this? Friends, family?" Sophia shook her head. "Derek doesn't like my friends. He says they're bad influences, that they don't understand what it takes to be in a serious relationship. And my family, my parents live across the country, and my sister is only 18. I didn't want to worry them, and I kept thinking I could handle it myself." "You are handling it," Dante said firmly. "You recognized the danger and removed yourself from the situation. That takes courage." "Is that what this is?" Sophia asked, gesturing to the luxurious penthouse around them. "Removing myself from the situation? Because it feels more like jumping from one dangerous man to another." Dante turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "I won't lie to you about what I am, Sophia. I'm involved in things that would horrify most people. I've done things that would give you nightmares. But I don't hurt innocent people, and I don't hurt women. Ever. That's not a line I cross, regardless of the circumstances." "How do I know that's true?" "You don't," Dante admitted. "You'll have to decide whether to trust me based on what you observe, not on what I tell you. But I'll give you one promise right now. You can leave whenever you want to. The door isn't locked, my security won't stop you, and I won't pursue you. This isn't a prison. It's a sanctuary, but only if you choose to see it that way." Sophia studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or manipulation, the kind of subtle cues she'd learned to recognize with Derek. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine concern, genuine respect for her autonomy and choice. When was the last time Derek had told her she could leave if she wanted to? When was the last time he'd given her a choice about anything at all? Her phone buzzed in her purse, and both of them froze. Sophia pulled it out with trembling hands, already knowing what she would find. Derek's name on the screen, along with a text message that made her blood run cold. "I know you're with him. This is a mistake you're going to regret. I'll be waiting when you come to your senses." Dante moved around the kitchen island smoothly, reading the message over her shoulder. His presence behind her was warm and solid, and she found herself leaning back against him instinctively before catching herself and stepping away. "How could he know where I am?" she asked, panic rising in her voice. I didn't tell him your name. I didn't say where we were going. Dante's expression had shifted, becoming harder and more focused. He probably followed us from the restaurant, or had someone else do it. Derek isn't stupid, and he's not going to give up easily. Men like him don't handle rejection well, especially not public rejection. Her phone buzzed again, and this time Derek's message was longer and more detailed. You don't know what you've gotten yourself into, Sophia. Dante Romano is not what he seems. He's dangerous, he's violent, and he will hurt you worse than you can imagine. Come home now, and we can forget this ever happened. Dante read the message without asking permission, his jaw tightening with each word. How much does Derek know about me? He asked. I don't know, Sophia said, her voice small. He seemed to recognize your name at the restaurant, but I thought that was just because of the construction connection. There is no construction connection, Dante said grimly. Vincent Morrison is a front for money laundering operations. If Derek is involved with Morrison, then he's already deeper in my world than either of you probably realized. The implications hit Sophia like a physical blow. Derek's work, his mysterious projects and demanding schedule, his father's construction business that always seemed to have more money than contracts could account for. How much of her boyfriend's life had been a lie? How much danger had she been in without ever knowing it? Dante moved to a panel hidden behind a piece of artwork, revealing a sophisticated security system with multiple monitors showing different angles of the building's exterior and interior. Street cameras, lobby feeds, elevator surveillance, even what looked like thermal imaging of the surrounding buildings. We're secure here, he said, studying the feeds carefully. My building has excellent security, and Derek doesn't have the resources or connections to get past it. But you should know that leaving here won't be as simple as walking out the door anymore. If Derek is connected to Morrison, then he has access to people who might be willing to take risks to get to you. Sophia sank onto one of the bar stools, the magnitude of her situation finally hitting her. She'd thought she was escaping an abusive boyfriend, making a clean break from a relationship that had turned toxic. Instead, she'd apparently stumbled into some kind of organized crime conflict that she didn't understand and had no idea how to navigate. I don't understand how this is my life now, she said quietly. Yesterday, I was worried about gallery showings and whether I could afford a new winter coat. Now I'm hiding in a penthouse from criminal organizations and trying to figure out which dangerous man is less likely to hurt me. Dante turned away from the security monitors, his expression softening as he took in her obvious distress. You didn't choose any of this, Sophia. Derek put you in danger without your knowledge or consent. I'm offering you a way out, but I understand if the cure seems as dangerous as the disease. He returned to the kitchen, and she watched him work with practiced efficiency, noting the way he moved with complete confidence in his own space. There was something soothing about watching him cook, something domestic and normal that helped ground her in the surreal situation. What are you making? She asked, needing to focus on something concrete and immediate. Risotto, Dante replied, stirring the rice with careful attention. My grandmother's recipe. She used to say that good food could solve almost any problem, at least temporarily. Do you cook often? I find it relaxing, he said. When you spend most of your time dealing with volatile personalities and high-stakes negotiations, there's something appealing about an activity where following the rules consistently produces good results. Sophia watched his hands as he worked, noting their size and obvious strength, but also their gentleness as he handled the delicate ingredients. These were hands that could probably kill efficiently if necessary, but right now they were creating something beautiful and nurturing for her benefit. Why are you helping me? She asked suddenly. You don't know me. You have no obligation to protect me, and getting involved in this situation obviously complicates your life. What do you get out of it? Dante paused in his stirring, considering her question. When I was 12, he said finally, I watched my father's business partner beat his wife in our kitchen during a family dinner. She disagreed with something he said about politics, nothing important, but he backhanded her so hard she fell off her chair. What happened? My father killed him, Dante said matter-of-factly. Not that night, but a few weeks later. He made it look like a business dispute, but it was really about what happened to Maria in our kitchen. My father had very specific rules about how men in his organization were allowed to treat women, and Antonio had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Sophia stared at him, trying to process the casual way he'd just described a murder motivated by domestic violence. It should have terrified her, but instead she found herself oddly moved by the story, by the idea that someone had cared enough about a woman's safety to take such extreme action. I was raised with certain principles, Dante continued. Protect your family, honor your commitments, and never harm anyone who can't fight back on equal terms. Women, children, civilians who have no part in our world. They're off limits, no matter what the circumstances. And you think I fit into that category? I think you're an innocent person who got caught up in something through no fault of your own, Dante said. And I think Derek is exactly the kind of man my father would have eliminated for crossing the line. The rice timer chimed, and Dante plated the risotto with professional precision, garnishing it with fresh herbs and Parmesan cheese. He set the plate in front of her with a glass of wine that he'd opened without her noticing, and the simple domesticity of the gesture made something in her chest warm unexpectedly. This smells incredible, Sophia said, taking her first bite and closing her eyes at the complex flavors. It's been months since anyone cooked for me. Derek didn't cook? Derek believed cooking was women's work, she said, then caught herself. I mean, he thought traditional gender roles were important for relationship stability. Dante's expression darkened. Traditional gender roles, he repeated. Let me guess. You were supposed to take care of the domestic responsibilities while he handled the important business of being successful. Something like that, Sophia admitted. He said it was natural division of labor based on our different strengths and preferences. And what were your preferences? Dante asked. Before Derek started telling you what they should be? Sophia paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, realizing she couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked her that question. Before Derek, she'd loved trying new restaurants, exploring different neighborhoods in the city, attending art openings and cultural events. She'd had opinions about politics and books and music that weren't filtered through Derek's approval or disapproval. I used to love discovering new artists, she said slowly. I'd spend weekends gallery hopping, looking for unknown painters and sculptors who might be good investments for the gallery. I had this dream of organizing an exhibition featuring only local artists under 30, giving them a platform to showcase their work. What happened to that dream? Derek said it was impractical, that I needed to focus on proven artists and established markets if I wanted the gallery to be profitable. He said my taste was too avant-garde for mainstream audiences. But it wasn't really about the gallery's profitability, was it? Dante said perceptively. No, Sophia admitted. It was about control. About making sure my professional goals aligned with his vision of what kind of woman he wanted to be with. They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes, and Sophia found herself relaxing for the first time in months. The food was incredible, the wine was smooth and warming, and the view of the city lights below was breathtaking. But more than that, she felt safe in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. Dante's presence beside her was solid and reassuring, dangerous but protective, like sitting next to a wolf that had chosen to guard rather than hunt. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was her sister Lily calling. Sophia hesitated, unsure whether answering would somehow make things worse or put Lily in danger. Answer it, Dante said quietly. But don't tell her where you are or who you're with. Just make sure she's safe. Lily, Sophia said, accepting the call with shaking hands. Sophie, thank God. Her sister's voice was tight with fear. Some guy came by my dorm looking for you. He said he was your boyfriend Derek and that you were in trouble, that he needed to find you to make sure you were okay. Sophie, he scared me. There was something wrong with him. What did you tell him? Sophia asked, panic rising. Nothing, Lily said quickly. I told him I hadn't heard from you in weeks, that we weren't that close. But Sophie, he knew things about me. About my classes, about my roommate's name, about where I work on weekends. How could he know those things? Sophia's blood ran cold as she realized Derek had been investigating her family, probably preparing for exactly this kind of situation. She met Dante's eyes across the kitchen island, seeing her own alarm reflected in his expression. Lily, listen to me carefully, Sophia said. I want you to pack a bag and go stay with your friend Rachel for a few days. Don't go back to your dorm until I call you and tell you it's safe. And if that man comes back, don't talk to him. Call campus security immediately. Sophie, you're scaring me. What's going on? I can't explain everything right now, but I promise I'm safe and I'll call you soon. Just please, do what I'm asking. It's important. She hung up before Lily could ask more questions and immediately felt Dante's hand cover hers on the countertop. His touch was warm and steadying, and she found herself gripping his fingers like a lifeline. "He's escalating faster than I expected," Dante said grimly. "Involving your sister means he's desperate and becoming less predictable. That makes him more dangerous. What do? We make sure your sister is protected, and we send Derek a message that continuing to pursue you will have consequences he doesn't want to face." Sophia looked at Dante's hard expression, at the way his entire demeanor had shifted from gentle protector to something much more dangerous and focused. "What kind of consequences?" she asked, though part of her was afraid to know the answer. "The kind that men like Derek understand better than words or legal threats," Dante replied. "The kind that end problems permanently." The next morning, Sophia woke to the smell of coffee and something that might have been fresh pastries, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of what she was beginning to think of as the most comfortable guest room she'd ever occupied. The bed was impossibly soft, the linens were clearly expensive, and she'd slept better than she had in months despite the surreal circumstances that had brought her here. She'd spent most of the previous evening on the phone with Lily, coordinating her sister's temporary relocation while trying to explain the situation without revealing too much about Dante or the true nature of Derek's connections. It had been a delicate balance, providing enough information to ensure Lily took the threat seriously while avoiding details that might put her in more danger. Dante had handled his own phone calls with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested he was accustomed to managing crises, speaking in Italian to what sounded like several different people while coordinating security measures she didn't fully understand. Watching him work had been both reassuring and unsettling, a reminder that she was now under the protection of someone who wielded considerable power in a world she knew nothing about. Now, padding barefoot toward the kitchen in the silk pajamas Dante had somehow procured for her the night before, Sophia felt almost normal for the first time since the restaurant confrontation. The morning light made everything seem less dramatic, less like a scene from a movie and more like a strange but not entirely unwelcome pause from her regular life. Dante was standing at the kitchen island with his back to her, wearing dark jeans and a white button-down shirt that was somehow more attractive than the expensive suits she'd seen him in previously. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and something about seeing him in casual clothes made him seem more human, more approachable, though no less dangerous. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned with a smile that transformed his entire face, and Sophia felt her pulse quicken at the genuine warmth in his expression. "Good morning, beautiful. I hope you slept well." The casual endearment should have bothered her, should have reminded her of Derek's possessive pet names, but somehow when Dante said it, the words felt like appreciation rather than ownership. "Better than I have in months," Sophia admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her. "Thank you for everything you've done. The clothes, the security arrangements for Lily, letting me stay here. I know this isn't your responsibility." Dante's expression grew serious as he studied her face. "It is now," he said simply. "The moment you walked out of that restaurant with me, it became my responsibility. That's not something I take lightly." Before Sophia could respond to that statement, the elevator chimed, and the doors opened to reveal two women who were clearly related to Dante. The older woman was probably in her late 50s, elegant and well-dressed, with the kind of bearing that spoke of authority and confidence. The younger one was closer to Sophia's age, beautiful in a dramatic way that suggested she was accustomed to being the center of attention. Dante moved to greet them with obvious affection, kissing both women on both cheeks in a gesture that was clearly habitual. "Mama, Isabella," he said warmly. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." The older woman, who could only be Dante's mother, studied Sophia with sharp dark eyes that missed nothing. "So this is the girl who has my son playing knight in shining armor," she said, her accent carrying just a trace of Italian inflection. "Mama," Dante warned, though his tone was affectionate rather than truly reproachful. "What?" Isabella said, grinning at her brother with obvious mischief. "I think it's romantic. Very old-fashioned. Very traditional. Papa would have approved." Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized she was being discussed as if she weren't there, but there was something warm and familiar about the family dynamic that reminded her of her own relationship with Lily. These people clearly loved each other deeply, and their teasing came from affection rather than malice. Sophia, Dante said, moving to her side with protective grace. I'd like you to meet my mother, Elena Romano, and my sister Isabella. Mama, Isabella, this is Sophia Chun. Elena's handshake was firm and assessing, but not unkind. Sophia Chun, she repeated, as if testing the name. And you work in art, Dante tells me. Yes, ma'am. I'm an assistant curator at the Meridian Gallery downtown. Elena's expression brightened with genuine interest. I know that gallery. They had an exhibition last year featuring local landscapes that I very much enjoyed. Was that your work? Partially, Sophia said, surprised and pleased by the connection. I helped select several of the artists and coordinate the installation. Beautiful work, Elena said with approval. It takes real vision to recognize talent before it becomes fashionable. The praise felt genuine rather than polite, and Sophia found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of having breakfast with her dangerous protector's family. Isabella moved around the kitchen with obvious familiarity, assembling what looked like an elaborate Italian breakfast spread while chattering to Dante in rapid Italian that Sophia couldn't follow but somehow found soothing. Isabella is a chef, Dante explained, noting Sophia's fascination with the food preparation. She owns 3 restaurants in the city and has been trying to expand into catering for years. Not trying, Isabella corrected with a laugh. Succeeding. We just landed the Romano Foundation Charity Gala next month, which means I'll be cooking for 500 of the city's most influential people. The Romano Foundation, Sophia repeated, filing away this new piece of information about Dante's legitimate business interests. Children's literacy programs, Elena explained. Dante started it 5 years ago after visiting schools in some of the city's underserved neighborhoods. We fund reading programs, library renovations, teacher training initiatives. Sophia looked at Dante with new understanding, trying to reconcile this information with what she knew about his criminal activities. How did someone involved in organized crime also run a children's charity? The contradiction was confusing but somehow endearing, adding another layer to the complex man who had rescued her from Derek's threats. My father believed that power came with obligations, Dante said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. That if you took from a community, you had to give back to it as well. Some of our business practices might be questionable, but the Foundation's work is completely legitimate. They ate breakfast together around Dante's dining table, the conversation flowing easily between English and Italian as Elena and Isabella shared family stories and asked Sophia questions about her work and background. It felt remarkably normal, like visiting friends rather than hiding from dangerous criminals, and Sophia found herself laughing more than she had in months. Isabella was in the middle of describing a disastrous catering event when Dante's phone rang. His expression shifted immediately as he looked at the caller ID, his relaxed demeanor becoming focused and alert. "Excuse me," he said, standing and moving toward his office. "I need to take this." The change in his tone sent a chill through Sophia, reminding her that their comfortable breakfast was taking place against the backdrop of a dangerous situation that was far from resolved. Elena seemed to notice her sudden tension, reaching across the table to pat her hand reassuringly. "Don't worry about whatever that call is, dear. Dante has been handling difficult situations since he was a teenager. He knows what he's doing." "How do you live with it?" Sophia asked impulsively. "Knowing that the people you love are involved in dangerous things, that they might not come home one day?" Elena's smile was sad and knowing. "The same way military wives live with it, I suppose. You focus on the good they do, on the people they protect, on the fact that someone has to stand between innocent people and the truly evil ones. And you trust that they're smart enough and strong enough to come home safe. But doesn't it frighten you?" "Of course it frightens me," Elena said honestly. "Every mother fears for her children's safety. But Dante's father taught him to be careful, to be strategic, to never take unnecessary risks. And more importantly, he taught him why our family does what we do." "What do you mean?" Elena glanced toward the office where Dante was still on the phone, his voice too low to make out the words, but his posture tense with concentration. "When Dante was 15, she said quietly, a rival family kidnapped a neighborhood girl to force her father to give up information about our operations. The girl was 12 years old, completely innocent, just a tool in their game. What happened? Dante's father eliminated the entire rival organization within 48 hours. Not just the men who had taken the girl, but everyone connected to the operation. It sent a message that involving civilians, especially children, in our conflicts was unacceptable. And the girl? She came home safe, Elena said with satisfaction. She's grown up now, married with children of her own. She probably doesn't even remember what happened to her. But Dante does. He remembers what it felt like to see an innocent person used as a weapon against people who couldn't protect her. Isabella had been listening to this conversation with obvious discomfort, and now she stood to clear the breakfast dishes. "Mama," she said gently, "you're going to scare her." "I'm not trying to scare her," Elena replied. "I'm trying to help her understand that the man protecting her now learned very early that some lines should never be crossed, and that people who cross them face consequences." Sophia absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the gentle man who had cooked for her the night before with someone capable of the kind of violence Elena was describing. But hadn't she already seen evidence of that duality? The way Dante had confronted Derek in the restaurant had been controlled and civilized, but there had been something absolutely lethal underneath his polite words. Dante returned from his office, his expression grim in a way that made Sophia's stomach clench with anxiety. The call had obviously brought bad news, and she braced herself for whatever new crisis Derek had created. "What is it?" Elena asked, reading her son's mood with obvious maternal expertise. "Derek hired a private investigator to track down Sophia's movements over the past few days," Dante said, his voice carefully controlled. The man approached 3 of her co-workers at the gallery, asking questions about her relationship with Derek, her daily routine, her family connections. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. "He's trying to build a case that I'm unstable," she said with sudden understanding. "That I need help. That he's just a concerned boyfriend trying to protect me from my own bad decisions." "Exactly," Dante confirmed. "He's laying groundwork to claim that you're having some kind of breakdown, that you've fallen under the influence of dangerous people who are manipulating you for their own purposes. It's actually quite clever," Isabella said with grudging admiration. "If he can convince people that you're a victim rather than someone making an independent choice, it becomes much harder for you to establish your own narrative about what happened." "Can he do that?" Sophia asked. "Can he actually make people believe that I've been kidnapped or coerced?" "With the right evidence and the right presentation," Elena said thoughtfully. "Especially if he has documentation of your previous relationship, evidence of your emotional state, testimony from people who will say you seemed afraid or confused." Sophia sank back in her chair, overwhelmed by the sophistication of Derek's strategy. She'd thought walking away from him would be the end of their relationship, that once she made her choice clear, he would have no option but to accept it. Instead, he was actively working to undermine her credibility and autonomy, turning her rescue into evidence of her victimization. "There's more," Dante said gently. "The private investigator also visited your sister yesterday evening, after she'd already moved to her friend's place. He found her there and convinced the friend to let him speak with Lily." "What did he tell her?" Sophia asked, though she was almost afraid to know. "That you'd been kidnapped by a dangerous criminal, that the police were involved but couldn't act without more information, and that she was the only one who could help them find you before something terrible happened." "No," Sophia whispered, imagining her 18-year-old sister's terror at hearing that she'd been kidnapped by organized crime figures. "Lily must be terrified. She must think I'm in terrible danger." "She is terrified," Dante confirmed. "But she's also smarter than Derek gave her credit for. She told the investigator that if the police were really involved, they would contact her directly rather than sending a private citizen to question her. She demanded to see his credentials and asked for the name and phone number of the police detective supposedly handling your case." Relief flooded through Sophia at this evidence of her sister's good sense, but it was quickly replaced by renewed anxiety. Derek wouldn't give up just because his first approach had failed. He would find another way to pressure Lily, to use her fear and love for Sophia as weapons in his campaign to force her return. "I have to call her," Sophia said, reaching for her phone. "I have to explain what's really happening, let her know I'm safe." Dante caught her hand gently, his touch warm and reassuring. "I've already taken care of it," he said. "Isabella spoke with Lily this morning, explained the situation in general terms, and arranged for her to be moved to a secure location until this is resolved." "Where is she?" "One of our family's safe houses in the mountains," Isabella said. "It's beautiful, completely isolated, and staffed with people who know how to keep her entertained and comfortable while ensuring her safety." She thinks she's on a spontaneous ski weekend with a friend of yours who's concerned about her emotional state after Derek's harassment. Sophia stared at the three Romano family members, trying to process the efficiency with which they had handled a crisis she hadn't even known existed. They had protected her sister, neutralized Derek's attempts to use Lily as leverage, and created a cover story that would keep her safe without traumatizing her further. "How do you do this?" she asked wonderingly. "How do you manage so many moving pieces, anticipate so many problems, coordinate so many people?" "Practice," Dante said with a slight smile. "And the knowledge that failure to be thorough has consequences we can't accept." The weight of their protection, the resources they were expending on her behalf, felt overwhelming. Sophia had never been the kind of person who needed or wanted to be rescued, had prided herself on her independence and self-sufficiency. Now she was entirely dependent on people she'd known for less than 48 hours, and the role reversal was both humbling and frightening. "I don't know how to repay this," she said quietly. "Any of this. The protection, the help with Lily, the risks you're all taking on my behalf." Elena leaned forward, her expression serious and kind. "Dear girl," she said gently, "when someone is drowning, you don't ask them to pay for the life preserver. You throw it to them because it's the right thing to do. But this is more than a life preserver," Sophia protested. "This is your family, your resources, your safety. Derek might have connections to people who could hurt you, and you're putting yourselves at risk for someone you barely know." "We know enough," Dante said firmly. "We know you're innocent of any wrongdoing. We know you're being threatened by someone who has no right to control your choices, and we know you have nowhere else to turn for help. That's enough." Isabella stood and moved to Sophia's chair, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Besides," she said with a smile, "any woman brave enough to walk away from an abusive man and trust herself to a stranger's protection is exactly the kind of person this family respects." The acceptance in their voices, the matter-of-fact way they spoke about protecting her, made something in Sophia's chest warm and expand. When was the last time she'd felt this supported, this valued, this genuinely cared for? Derek had spoken about caring for her, about wanting to protect her, but his version of protection had felt like imprisonment. The Romano family's protection felt like freedom. Dante's phone buzzed with a text message, and his expression darkened as he read it. "Derek again," he said grimly, showing them the screen. "I know you have her, and I know what kind of man you are. This won't end the way you think it will. I have resources you don't know about, and I'm prepared to use them. Give me what's mine, and nobody has to get hurt." The possessive language, the implication that she was property to be returned, made Sophia's stomach turn with anger and disgust. Even now, even after everything that had happened, Derek still thought of her as something he owned rather than someone with her own will and choices. "What's mine?" she repeated, her voice shaking with fury. "What's mine? Like I'm a piece of furniture he left behind when he moved out." "Men like Derek don't see women as people," Elena said with distaste. "They see them as possessions, extensions of themselves, things that exist to serve their needs and reflect their status." "But you're not his," Isabella said firmly. "You never were. You were just a person in a relationship that stopped working, and you had every right to leave when it became unhealthy." Dante was studying Derek's message with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was analyzing it for more than just its obvious content. "Resources I don't know about," he murmured. "That's interesting phrasing. What do you think it means?" Sophia asked. "It means Derek has been planning this longer than we realized," Dante replied. "And it means he has backup plans we haven't discovered yet." Before Sophia could ask what kind of backup plans Derek might have, Dante's phone rang again. This time his entire posture changed as he looked at the caller ID, shifting from focused concern to genuine alarm. "What is it?" Elena asked, clearly recognizing her son's expression. "It's Marco," Dante said, accepting the call. "Marco only calls directly when there's immediate danger." The conversation was brief and conducted entirely in Italian, but Sophia could tell from Dante's tone that the news was serious. When he hung up, his expression was grim and focused in a way that made her heart race with anxiety. "Derek isn't working alone," Dante said without preamble. "Marco's contacts in the police department confirmed that Derek filed a missing person report this morning, claiming you've been kidnapped by organized crime figures and are being held against your will." "But that's not true," Sophia protested, even as she realized how futile the protest was. Truth doesn't matter if he can make his story convincing, Elena said grimly. And a missing person report gives him legal cover to involve law enforcement in his search for you. It gets worse, Dante continued. Derek provided the police with security camera footage from the restaurant, showing you leaving with me under what he's characterizing as duress. He also gave them photos of you looking distressed and afraid, taken over the past few weeks without your knowledge. Sophia felt the walls closing in around her as she realized the sophistication of Derek's manipulation. He'd been documenting her emotional state, probably planning for exactly this scenario, creating evidence that could be used to support whatever narrative served his purposes. He's been photographing me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Taking pictures of me when I was upset or scared, building a case that I was unstable or in danger. Classic abuser behavior, Isabella said with disgust. Create the conditions that cause distress, then document the results as evidence of instability. The problem, Dante said heavily, is that his story is partially true. You are with organized crime figures. You did leave with me under circumstances that could be interpreted as coercive, and you are technically missing from your normal life and routine. So what do we do? Sophia asked, feeling trapped between Derek's lies and the complicated truth of her current situation. Dante stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city below with the kind of focused concentration that suggested he was planning something complex and potentially dangerous. We end this, he said finally, turning back to face them with an expression that was both protective and absolutely lethal. We make it clear to Derek that continuing to pursue you will have consequences he's not prepared to face. How? By reminding him that some games are too dangerous for amateurs to play, Dante replied, and that men who threaten innocent people sometimes discover they've chosen the wrong target. Before Sophia could ask what that meant, Dante was across the room and pulling her into his arms, his movement so sudden and fluid that she barely had time to register his intention before his mouth was on hers. The kiss was gentle but possessive, tender but absolutely claiming, and Sophia felt her entire world narrow to the sensation of his lips moving against hers with devastating skill. When he finally pulled back, she was breathless and shaking, her hands fisted in the front of his shirt as if she needed something solid to anchor her to reality. I won't let him hurt you, Dante said quietly, his forehead resting against hers in a gesture of intimate protection. Whatever it takes, whatever the cost, you're safe now. You're mine to protect, and that means something in my world. The possessive declaration should have frightened her, should have reminded her of Derek's controlling behavior. Instead, it made her feel cherished and valued and completely secure for the first time in months. I'm starting to understand that, Sophia whispered, meeting his dark eyes with a trust that surprised them both. And I'm starting to trust you with that responsibility. Good, Dante said, his smile warm and dangerous and full of promise. Because this is just the beginning. That evening, after Elena and Isabella had left with promises to check on Lily and coordinate additional security measures, Sophia found herself alone with Dante in the quiet intimacy of his penthouse. The city lights twinkled below them like scattered diamonds, and the space felt different somehow, charged with the memory of their kiss and the unspoken acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted between them. They'd spent the afternoon going through Derek's social media presence and business connections, trying to understand the full scope of his resources and potential allies. The picture that emerged was troubling. Derek's family construction business had contracts with several companies that Dante recognized as fronts for money laundering operations, suggesting that Derek's access to criminal networks was more extensive than either of them had initially realized. Now, as they sat together on the couch with files and photographs spread across the coffee table, Sophia was acutely aware of Dante's presence beside her, the way his shoulder brushed hers when he leaned forward to point out something in the documents. The scent of his cologne, warm and masculine and somehow comforting. The sound of his voice as he explained the complex web of relationships and obligations that governed his world. You should eat something, Dante said, noticing that she'd been staring at the same photograph for several minutes without really seeing it. You've barely touched your dinner. I'm not really hungry, Sophia admitted. Too much adrenaline, I think. Too many revelations about how little I actually knew about the man I was dating for 8 months. Dante set down the file he'd been reviewing and turned to face her fully, his dark eyes searching her expression with gentle concern. Are you having second thoughts about being here? About trusting me with your safety? No, Sophia said immediately, surprised by how certain she felt. If anything, I'm wondering why it feels so natural to trust you when I should probably be terrified. You're involved in illegal activities, you've admitted to violence, you live in a world I don't understand at all. By any reasonable measure, I should be more afraid of you than I was of Derek. But you're not. No, I'm not, she confirmed, meeting his gaze steadily. With Derek, I always felt like I was walking on eggshells, like I had to constantly monitor my behavior to avoid triggering his anger. With you, even knowing what you're capable of, I feel safe. Protected. Like I can be myself without worrying about consequences. Dante's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle and warm and infinitely careful. You can be yourself, he said quietly. Whatever that means, whoever you are when you're not performing a role someone else created for you. That's who I want to know. The simple statement, spoken with such sincerity, made something inside Sophia's chest break open. When was the last time someone had wanted to know the real her, rather than the version of herself that was most convenient for them? When was the last time she'd felt genuinely seen and valued for who she actually was rather than who she could become with the right guidance and correction? I don't think I remember who that person is anymore, she whispered, leaning into his touch despite the vulnerability the admission required. Derek spent so long telling me what I should want, what I should think, how I should behave, that I lost track of my own preferences and opinions. Then we'll figure it out together, Dante said, his thumb stroking gently across her cheekbone. We'll give you space to rediscover yourself without anyone telling you who you should be. The kindness in his voice, the genuine care and patience, made tears burn behind Sophia's eyes. She'd been so focused on escaping Derek's control that she hadn't really considered what came next, what rebuilding her sense of self would look like, or how long it might take. The fact that Dante was willing to be patient with that process, to support her journey of rediscovery without trying to influence its direction, meant more to her than he probably realized. What if you don't like who I turn out to be? She asked, voicing a fear she hadn't even acknowledged to herself. Dante's smile was warm and certain and full of affection that made her heart race. Then I'll be disappointed in my own judgment, he said simply. But I don't think that's going to happen. I've seen glimpses of who you are when you're not afraid, when you're not performing, when you're just reacting naturally to situations. And I like that person very much. Before Sophia could respond, Dante was kissing her again, his mouth moving against hers with the kind of tender intensity that made her forget everything else. This time, when he pulled back, she was the one who moved closer, her hands sliding up to frame his face as she looked into his dark eyes. I want you, she said quietly, the words coming from some deep, honest part of herself that Derek had tried to silence. I know this is complicated. I know the timing is terrible. I know we barely know each other. But I want you, and I want to stop pretending that I don't. Dante's expression grew serious, his hands coming up to cover hers where they rested against his cheek. Are you sure, he asked. Are you sure this is what you want? Not just what you think you should want. Not just a reaction to everything that's happened? I'm sure, Sophia said, and she was. This wasn't rebellion against Derek or gratitude for Dante's protection or some confused attempt to replace one relationship with another. This was desire, pure and simple and entirely her own choice. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Dante stood and extended his hand to her, his movement fluid and graceful and full of promise. Then let me show you how a woman should be cherished, he said softly. Sophia took his offered hand and let him lead her toward his bedroom, her heart racing with anticipation and nerves and a kind of excitement she'd almost forgotten existed. Dante's bedroom was as elegantly appointed as the rest of the penthouse, all warm colors and soft textures that spoke of comfort and luxury, but she barely had time to register the details before his attention was entirely focused on her. He undressed her slowly, reverently, as if she were something precious and fragile that required careful handling. His hands were gentle but sure as they explored her body, learning her responses, discovering what made her gasp and arch against him. When he finally joined with her, it was with a tenderness and consideration that brought tears to her eyes. Derek had treated intimacy like a service she owed him, something to be gotten through as quickly and efficiently as possible. Dante treated it like worship, like an opportunity to demonstrate his devotion and care for her pleasure above his own. He moved with her rather than against her, constantly checking her comfort, constantly ensuring that she was with him every step of the way. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the expensive sheets with moonlight streaming through the windows, Sophia felt a contentment she'd never experienced before. Her head was pillowed on Dante's chest, his fingers combing gently through her hair, and everything felt perfect in a way that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. "Are you all right?" Dante asked softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Better than all right," Sophia murmured against his skin. "I'm beginning to understand what I've been missing all this time." "What's that?" "Being with someone who actually cares about my experience, who wants me to feel good, who treats my pleasure as important as their own. With Derek, I always felt like I was performing a role rather than sharing something meaningful." "You'll never have to perform with me," Dante said firmly. "What we have, what we're building together, it's real. It's based on who you actually are, not who someone else wants you to be." Sophia lifted her head to look at him, taking in his relaxed expression, the way his dark hair was mussed from her fingers, the contentment in his eyes. "I'm falling in love with you," she said quietly, the admission coming easier than she'd expected. "I know that's probably crazy. I know we've only known each other for 2 days, but I can't pretend it's not happening." Dante's smile was soft and wonderful and full of an emotion that matched her own. "It's not crazy," he said, his hand coming up to stroke her cheek. "It's not crazy because I'm falling in love with you too. Have been since I watched you walk away from Derek in that restaurant, since I saw you choose courage over safety." They made love again as the city slept below them, slower this time, more exploratory, learning each other's bodies and responses with the kind of thorough attention that spoke of genuine care and connection. By the time they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, Sophia felt like she'd come home to herself for the first time in years. She woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and breakfast cooking, sunlight warm on her skin and Dante's voice drifting from the kitchen as he spoke on the phone in rapid Italian. For a moment, she lay still and simply absorbed the feeling of being exactly where she belonged, safe and wanted and cherished in a way that felt almost too good to be real. The conversation in the kitchen grew more intense, Dante's tone shifting from casual to sharp with concern, and Sophia felt the first flutter of anxiety penetrate her contentment. She pulled on one of Dante's shirts and padded toward the kitchen, arriving just as he ended the call with what sounded like a string of Italian curses. "What is it?" she asked, reading the tension in his posture. "Derek's escalated faster than we anticipated," Dante said grimly, pulling her into his arms as if he needed the reassurance of her physical presence. "The private investigator he hired has been asking questions about my family's business operations, and he's been sharing that information with people who have their own reasons for wanting to create problems for us." "What people?" "The Torino family," Dante said, his voice carrying a weight of history and conflict that made Sophia's blood run cold. "They've been trying to move into our territory for years, and they see your presence here as an opportunity to create leverage against us." "I don't understand." "They're going to try to use you against me," Dante explained, his arms tightening around her protectively. "Either by taking you themselves and offering to trade you for territory concessions, or by helping Derek build his case that you're being held against your will and need to be rescued." Sophia felt the familiar panic rising, the sense that forces beyond her control were reshaping her life without her consent. But this time, instead of feeling helpless and trapped, she felt angry. Angry that Derek refused to accept her choice. Angry that strangers thought they could use her as a weapon against Dante. Angry that her attempt to escape one controlling situation had somehow landed her in the middle of a criminal conflict she'd never asked to be part of. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We give you a choice," Dante said seriously. "Marco has a safe house in Canada where you could stay until this situation resolves itself. You'd be completely protected, completely safe, and completely removed from any danger that comes from your association with me. And the other option? You stay here, with me, and we face this together. But you need to understand what that means, Sophia. If you stay, you're accepting that you're part of my world now, with all the risks and complications that entails. You're accepting that people will try to hurt you to get to me, and that I'll do whatever is necessary to prevent that from happening." Sophia looked into Dante's dark eyes, seeing the conflict there, the way he was torn between wanting to keep her safe and wanting to keep her close. She thought about the choice he was offering her, about the easy escape to Canada versus the dangerous commitment to building something real with him despite the obstacles. "I'm not going to Canada," she said firmly. "I'm not going to let Derek or the Torino family or anyone else chase me away from the first relationship that's ever made me feel truly valued and protected. Sophia, you don't understand what you're choosing. This isn't just about staying with me. It's about accepting a life that includes violence and danger and constant vigilance. It's about being with someone whose enemies will always see you as a target." "I understand better than you think," Sophia said, her hands coming up to frame his face the way he'd done for her the night before. "I understand that you're giving me a real choice, not manipulating me into the decision you prefer. I understand that you're being honest about the risks rather than hiding them from me. And I understand that what we have is worth fighting for, even if it means accepting a world you never wanted to be part of, especially because it means accepting a world where someone values my choices enough to let me make them," Sophia said with conviction. "Derek tried to control me by making decisions for my own good. You're trusting me to make my own decisions, even when they might not be the safest ones. That's the difference between love and control." Dante's kiss was fierce and grateful and full of relief that he hadn't tried to hide. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers in the gesture that was becoming familiar and dear. "Then we face this together," he said quietly. "But I need you to understand that once you make this choice, once you commit to being part of this world, there's no going back to your old life. Everything changes from here." "Everything already has changed," Sophia pointed out. "The moment Derek decided to involve criminal organizations in his campaign to control me, my old life stopped being an option." Dante's phone buzzed with an incoming message, and his expression grew grim as he read it. "Derek again," he said, showing her the screen. "But this time he's not alone." The message was brief but chilling. "Last chance, Romano. Return what belongs to me, or discover what happens when you involve innocent people in business that doesn't concern them." Attached was a photograph of Lily, clearly taken without her knowledge, along with the address of the safe house where she was supposedly secure. "They found her," Sophia whispered, terror flooding through her at the realization that her sister's safety had been compromised. "No," Dante said quickly, his voice calm despite the obvious urgency of the situation. "That photograph was taken yesterday, before we moved her. It's a bluff, designed to make us think they have more information than they actually do." "How can you be sure?" "Because the location in the background doesn't match the safe house where she actually is," Dante said, pointing out details in the photograph that Sophia had missed in her panic. "This was taken at the university campus, probably when the investigator first approached her. They're trying to make us panic and make mistakes." But even as he spoke, Dante was already moving toward his office, his movements sharp with focus and determination. The fact that Derek's allies had been able to track Lily's movements at all suggested resources and capabilities that needed to be taken seriously. "What are you going to do?" Sophia asked, following him. "I'm going to end this," Dante said grimly, pulling out phones and weapons with practiced efficiency. Derek wanted to play in a world he doesn't understand, and now he's going to learn why that was a mistake. "What does that mean?" "It means Derek and his new allies are about to discover that some people are too dangerous to threaten," Dante replied, his voice carrying a cold promise that made Sophia understand exactly what kind of man she'd chosen to love. "And that innocent people who get caught in criminal conflicts sometimes receive more protection than their enemies bargained for." The attack came 3 days later, coordinated and planned with the kind of precision that confirmed Derek's new allies were far more dangerous than a simple private investigator. Sophia was returning from a carefully supervised visit to the gallery, accompanied by 2 of Dante's security personnel, when the first car blocked their path on the quiet street leading to his building. She watched in horrified fascination as the second car appeared behind them, trapping their vehicle between 2 groups of armed men who moved with military efficiency. This wasn't the chaotic violence she'd seen in movies. This was something cold and professional and absolutely terrifying in its execution. "Stay down," Marco commanded from the driver's seat, his voice calm despite the obvious danger. His hand moved to his weapon with practiced ease, and Sophia realized this was exactly the kind of situation Dante had prepared for. The reason she'd been assigned professional protection rather than simply being told to stay hidden. The lead car's passenger door opened, and Derek stepped out wearing expensive clothes and an expression of righteous determination that made Sophia's stomach turn. Behind him were three men she didn't recognize, all of them armed and clearly comfortable with the weapons they carried. "Sophia-chan," Derek called out, his voice carrying the same tone of patient reasonableness he'd used when correcting her behavior during their relationship. "You're safe now. I'm here to bring you home where you belong." The familiar manipulation, the assumption that he knew better than she did what was good for her, ignited a fury in Sophia that surprised her with its intensity. This man had terrorized her sister, involved criminal organizations in his personal vendetta, and was now pointing guns at people who were trying to protect her, all because he couldn't accept that she'd chosen to leave him. "I am home," Sophia said clearly, raising her voice so Derek could hear her through the car windows. "I made my choice, Derek. Accept it and leave me alone." Derek's expression hardened at her defiance, his mask of concerned boyfriend slipping to reveal the cold anger underneath. "You don't know what you're saying, Sophia. You've been brainwashed, manipulated by criminals who are using you for their own purposes. But I'm going to save you from them, whether you understand that you need saving or not." Before Sophia could respond, the street exploded into controlled chaos. Dante's men appeared from positions she hadn't even known they occupied, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training and experience. The confrontation was brief, efficient, and absolutely decisive. Derek's hired muscle, despite their professional appearance, were outmatched and outmaneuvered within minutes. Dante himself appeared as if materializing from shadows, moving through the conflict with lethal grace and purpose. When the violence ended, Derek was on his knees in the street with Dante's gun pressed against the back of his neck. "You made a mistake, Derek," Dante said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. "You involved innocent people in a criminal conflict. You threatened a woman under my protection. And you allied yourself with people who forgot why certain boundaries exist in our world." Sophia watched from the car as Dante leaned down to speak directly into Derek's ear, his words too quiet for her to hear, but obviously devastating in their impact. Derek's face went white with terror, his entire body shaking as he finally understood the true nature of the man he'd been trying to manipulate and threaten. The Torino associates who had survived the brief conflict were being systematically questioned by Dante's people, and Sophia could see that information was being extracted with the kind of efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first experience with interrogation techniques. When Dante finally approached the car, his expression immediately softened as he saw Sophia's face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands gentle as they checked her for injuries. "I'm fine," Sophia said, though she was shaking from adrenaline and the realization of how close she'd come to being taken. "Is it over? Is Derek?" "Derek is alive," Dante said, understanding her question. "But his involvement in this situation is permanently concluded. He's been made to understand that any future attempts to contact or threaten you will have consequences that he's not prepared to face." "What about the Torinos?" "That problem has been resolved as well," Dante replied, his tone suggesting that she didn't want details about the resolution. "They overplayed their hand when they decided to use you as leverage against my family. That's not a mistake they'll have the opportunity to repeat." Over the following days, as the last traces of Derek's campaign against her were systematically eliminated, Sophia found herself settling into Dante's world with surprising ease. The violence of the confrontation had been shocking but not traumatic, largely because she'd felt protected throughout the experience rather than helpless or victimized. The difference between Derek's version of protection and Dante's was becoming clearer every day. Derek had tried to protect her by controlling her environment, limiting her choices, making decisions on her behalf. Dante protected her by eliminating external threats while respecting her autonomy, by giving her information and trusting her to make good decisions, by ensuring she had the tools and support she needed to protect herself. 2 weeks after the street confrontation, Dante took her back to the restaurant where they'd first met, requesting the same table where she'd sat with Derek on that night that felt like a lifetime ago. The elegant dining room looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed so completely that Sophia could barely recognize the frightened, controlled woman she'd been just a month earlier. "Do you remember what you were thinking that night?" Dante asked as they shared dinner at the table where he'd first intervened on her behalf. "I was trying to figure out how to survive the conversation Derek wanted to have when we got home," Sophia said honestly. "I was scared and trapped and convinced I had no options except to endure whatever he decided I deserved. And now? Now I know the difference between a man who wants to own me and a man who wants to love me," Sophia said, meeting his dark eyes with confidence she'd never felt before. "Now I know what it feels like to be valued for who I am rather than who I might become with the right guidance and correction." Dante reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and sure and infinitely gentle. "I have something I want to ask you," he said, his voice carrying a nervousness that was oddly endearing from someone so confident and dangerous. He stood and moved around the table, dropping to one knee beside her chair in a gesture that made her heart stop completely. The other diners in the restaurant began to notice the scene unfolding, but Sophia barely registered their attention, too focused on the man kneeling before her with love and hope and absolute devotion in his expression. "Sophia Chun," Dante said, pulling out a ring box that contained the most beautiful diamond she'd ever seen. "You've taught me what it means to love someone without trying to control them, to protect someone while respecting their choices, to build something real based on trust and honesty rather than fear and manipulation. Will you marry me?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sophia felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at this man who had saved her from Derek's abuse only to show her what genuine love and partnership could look like. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, absolutely yes." The restaurant erupted in applause as Dante slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her with a passion that made her forget they had an audience. When they finally broke apart, Sophia felt like her entire life was beginning rather than simply continuing, like everything that had come before had been preparation for this moment of perfect happiness and commitment. The wedding took place 3 months later in the garden of the Romano family estate, surrounded by flowers and fairy lights, and the two families that had embraced their union with genuine joy. Lily, fully recovered from her ordeal and charmed by the Romano family's protection and care, served as maid of honor and spent most of the reception flirting with Isabella's sous chef. Elena Romano had thrown herself into wedding planning with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for military campaigns, coordinating details with Sophia's mother over video calls and ensuring that every element of the celebration reflected both families' traditions and values. The result was elegant and warm and perfect in a way that made Sophia grateful for the strong women who had welcomed her into their world. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Sophia looked up at her new husband and marveled at the journey that had brought them together. 6 months ago, she'd been trapped in a relationship that diminished her, controlled by a man who saw her as property rather than a person. Now she was married to someone who had literally fought for her right to make her own choices, who had protected her while respecting her autonomy, who had shown her what real love looked like. "I love you, Mrs. Romano," Dante murmured against her ear as they swayed together in the warm evening air. "I love you too," Sophia replied, the words feeling like a promise and a celebration and a declaration of independence all at once. 6 months later, Sophia stood in the office of what had once been the Meridian Gallery, now expanded and renamed the Romano Arts Foundation. The space hummed with activity as her team prepared for the opening of their latest exhibition featuring emerging local artists, exactly the kind of show she'd dreamed of organizing during those dark months with Derek. The foundation was Dante's wedding gift to her, his way of ensuring that she could pursue her professional passion without financial constraints or external pressure. She'd been able to hire additional staff, expand their programming, and create opportunities for artists who might never have found platforms for their work otherwise. The irony wasn't lost on her that a marriage to a man involved in criminal activities had given her more professional freedom and personal autonomy than she'd ever experienced in her supposedly legitimate relationship with Derek. Dante's world might operate outside conventional legal boundaries, but it was governed by codes of honor and respect that Derek's supposedly respectable business practices had completely lacked. "Sophia," Isabella called from the gallery entrance. "You have a visitor." She turned to see Dante entering with an expression of barely contained excitement, his hands behind his back in a way that suggested he was hiding something. The sight of him still made her pulse quicken, still filled her with the kind of happiness and contentment she'd never imagined possible. "What's behind your back?" she asked suspiciously, noting his obvious attempts to suppress a grin. "A surprise," Dante said, revealing a small wrapped box with theatrical flourish. Sophia accepted the gift with curiosity, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a tiny pair of baby shoes in soft yellow leather. She stared at them for a long moment before their significance hit her, her heart beginning to race with joy and excitement and a kind of overwhelming love for this man who somehow always knew exactly what she needed. "Are you telling me what I think you're telling me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm telling you that in about 7 months, our family is going to grow by one small Romano who is going to be the most protected and loved child in the history of organized crime," Dante said, pulling her into his arms with the kind of gentle reverence he'd shown her from the very beginning. They kissed there in the gallery, surrounded by art and possibility and the future they were building together, and Sophia marveled at how different her life had become from the nightmare it had been just over a year earlier. She'd escaped Derek's control only to discover what real partnership looked like, had fled from false protection only to find genuine love and respect and safety. As they stood together planning for their child and their future and the continued growth of the foundation, Sophia thought about the scared woman she'd been in that restaurant, asking permission to use the restroom and apologizing for crimes she hadn't committed. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she remembered but could barely connect to her current confident, loved, truly protected self. Whatever your relationship situation looks like right now, wherever you are in your journey toward finding genuine love and respect, remember that you deserve someone who values your choices rather than controlling them, someone who protects you by eliminating external threats rather than by limiting your freedom. Real love makes you stronger, not smaller. Real protection comes from facing dangers together, not from avoiding them alone. The Romano family had taught her that strength came not from avoiding dangerous situations, but from having people you trusted to face them with you. That true safety wasn't about hiding from the world, but about building relationships strong enough to weather any storm. And as Dante's hand settled protectively over her still flat stomach and his other arm pulled her close against his chest, Sophia knew that whatever challenges their future might hold, they would face them together, with the kind of love and partnership that could transform even the most dangerous circumstances into opportunities for growth and joy and absolute, perfect happiness.